Good morning, everybody. No need to ask you whether you had an enjoyable gala night yesterday. So what's all the response? And I trust you had a restful night for a very fruitful day of exchange today. I'll start as well by saying that I'm very happy and honored to be here. So I thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. Okay. The presentation I'm about to deliver is not about, even though it's the economics of electricity in the context of Utility 2.0, it's not about piling up figures and figures and figures, but rather discussing economic principles and trends driven by some disruptions in the energy ecosystem. Naturally, we can't do without some figures. We'll use some as reference points and illustrate trends with charts as much as possible. The whole day yesterday, we've discussed very unanimously of the changes, the major changes that utilities are facing in this changing ecosystem. I guess that, or I will say that change is a weak word for that. Utilities have gone through changes the past decades. And for this level of change, we can say that utilities are really facing a revolution. And to be fair, we must say that this is not limited to the utilities, but to the entire spectrum of players in the energy ecosystem. So, and of course, utilities which have held the position of sovereigns of the grid for many decades are in the front line of this revolution and are obviously the most severely touched, and that therefore are required to make the maximum effort to adapt to this situation. Let me ask you this question. Do you feel that your utilities service you, or do they only sell you kilowatt hours? How many people do think that their utility service them here? None. How many do think that they are sold kilowatt hours? Okay. So I guess that, and how many of you are happy with their utilities? Okay, not many. A couple of you. Okay. So it's obvious that utilities, or you feel that utilities treat you as consumers more than customers. So for service providers, they are expected to be, and that's the reason why most of you are not happy with them. I only know one pathway towards success. It's getting the customer happy by any means. And in such a recurrent long-term relationship, one must invest on the satisfaction on its customers. Okay, that's fine. So I was saying that for service providers, they are expected to be, I only know one pathway toward success. It's getting the customer happy by any means. And in such a recurrent long-term relationship, one must invest in on the satisfaction of the customers. Unless any of you know any other way to achieve that goal. I guess I assume that we agree on that, and it doesn't take any scientist nor economist to predict the ultimate failure of utilities operating in total ignorance of its customers. And guess what? This is only basic economics. Customer doesn't get the value it expects, the relationship is in jeopardy. And this is valid for all service industries. Somebody mentioned yesterday the situation of the taxi industry in France facing Uber. I myself, a frequent traveler going through Paris airport at least twice a month. So I was one of the users of those taxis. But they tend to treat me like utilities. Most utilities are treating the customers, so our consumers. So you get out of the airport, you look for a taxi. They have you find them having an interesting discussions with their colleagues, and they just don't want to service you because for them getting a customer is not a problem. They don't take you. 5 minutes later, when they're done with their discussion, they will take the next passenger. So they ignore totally what service means to the customers. And this is valid as well for the airline industries. And you can find as many examples as service industries exist. Airline industries used to sell us tickets. Now, the most successful airlines are the ones that mine the satisfaction of their client, so trying to do as much as possible to get the customer's life easier. And with these changes, many of you think that utilities are not well equipped to face this tremendous challenge. From the response of the large part of the audience yesterday, it is only fair to say that the requisite adjustment for utilities to adapt to the challenging or new ecosystem here will not be a natural process. Therefore, they will need help. And that's where other players comes into play. Policymakers, regulators. A keynote presenter yesterday touched on this point from a climate change perspective. I think it was Mr. Joubert. He said that for climate change, for the COP21 objectives to materialize, strong and consistent signals must be sent by authorities, by policymakers, by regulators. It's the same here. I guess that we need more enabling regulations, adequate policies, tariff structures that would incentivize a better value proposition to the customers, and you name it. Now let's dive into some economic consideration of the electricity market and identify the impacts. This chart exhibits the price history of silicon PV cells over the last 4 decades. Photovoltaic prices have fallen from 76 US dollar per watt in 1977 to 30 cents per watt last year for silicon solar cells. By 2011, price of PV modules per megawatt had fallen by 60% since 2008, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates. So putting solar power for the first time on a competitive footing with the retail price of electricity in some sunny countries. The levelized cost of electricity from PV is competitive with conventional electricity sources in an expanding list of geographies today. There has been fierce competition in the supply chain and further improvement in the levelized cost of energy for solar. And this is posing, of course, a growing threat to the dominance of fossil fuels generation sources in the next few years. Renewable energy technology generally get cheaper over time, while fossil fuels generally get more expensive. So the less solar power costs, the more favorably it compares to conventional power. And the more attractive it becomes to utilities and energy users around the globe. It has been observed that prices fall approximately 20% for every doubling of industry capacity. This chart actually is not should be read like this way. So this is showing the downward trend of PV module price versus the production volumes. So utility scale solar power can now be delivered at prices well below 10 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour, less than most other peak generator sources, even those running on low-cost natural gas. Lower solar module costs also stimulate demand from consumer markets, where the cost of solar compares very favorably to retail electricity rates. Last year, First Solar agreed to supply solar power at about 4 cents per kilowatt hour levelized price from its 100 megawatt Playa Solar 2 project in Nevada, which is far cheaper than the electricity sale price for conventional electricity generation plants. Similar stories could be told for wind power as well, with a less dramatic change. From the 80s until now, wind energy cost has dramatically dropped as well by more than 60%, and is expected to follow a downward trend as wind turbine technology improves. There are now longer and lighter wind turbines blades, improvement in turbine performance, and increase power generation efficiency. Also, wind project capital and maintenance costs have continued to decline as well. For example, the wind industry in the USA in 2014 was able to produce more power at lower cost by using taller wind turbines with longer blades, capturing the faster winds at higher elevation. This was open, this turbine actually with longer blades opened up new opportunities. So the price of power from wind turbines built 300 to 400 feet above the ground can now compete with conventional fossil fuels like coal. So prices have fallen to about 4 cents per kilowatt hour in some cases. And utilities have been increasing the amount of wind energy in their portfolio, saying it's their cheapest option today. As a consequence, more projects were financed through debt arrangement than tax equity structures last year, so winning more mainstream acceptance from the financial markets. Additionally, equipment makers can deliver products in the same year that they are ordered instead of waiting up to 3 years, as was the case in previous cycles. So in this chart, you're seeing in blue the downward trend of installed cost of wind, and in yellow, the one for solar, in the case of the USA, in dollar per kilowatt. So the curve is more dramatic for solar than wind, but for the two of them, it's a downward trend. So let's look at the consequences and impact of these economics. So there is a shift in the economics of the grid, obviously. And let's look at some actual figures and some projections in the coming decades in the USA. So this is showing the levelized cost of energy. So US dollar per megawatt hour in 2015, 220, 225 until 2040 for onshore wind, utility scale solar PV, natural gas and coal. And you see how in the USA, solar PV, utility scale solar PV and wind are outweighing natural gas and coal sources. And what's the impact of this in this specific case? About 6,000 megawatt of new installed capacity is under construction in the US, more than double the number at this point in 2010. And 35% of all new power generation built in the US since 2005 has come from wind, more than new gas and coal power plants combined. So power providers are increasingly tempted to wind as a convenient hedge against unpredictable commodity price moves. And I'm giving the example of the USA here, but this is a global pattern to the rest of the world, including Africa. For comparison, let's look at the same for Europe. The same trend apply, even if it happens faster than in the US. We can look at the same in China as well. Look at what's happening in 2025 for wind, and then later for solar. Solar and wind still outweigh coal and natural gas. And let's finish by looking at the same for India. We had interesting discussions yesterday for coal and what it represents in India. I guess that this is very interesting food for thought for Indian authorities and strategists in the energy industry. So, in summary, Fatih Birol, the chief economist at the International Energy Agency, just reminds us that renewable energy is gaining a predominant position in the emerging power systems. So, as you saw with the figures, this is already happening, and this will continue to materialize. So, an impact, interesting impact on this. This chart shows you new investment in renewable energy. So the history of new investment in the renewable energy the past decade. So for solar, wind, large hydro, and others. Look at the yellow and the light blue. So it's solar and wind. Look at from 2004 until 2014, where the figures have been compiled. But you can guess that it has happened last year, and it will continue growing this year and the coming months. So all we've said until now, this is the impact. So the dramatic curves of the PV technology price, of the wind technology prices, etc., is making energy generators decide to shift and to prioritize these such kind of energies in their portfolio. So, and this is an example of that. So, after the history, or the historical figures of the last decade, this is a projection. Still the same. Total investment for renewable energy here per technology, solar, wind, against fossil fuels, until 2040. So renewables take 65% of the 12 trillion power investment. So solar in yellow, utility scale, and a small scale PV, and then wind. So after having said all this, predominantly for solar and wind, let's just touch upon other technologies. I would certainly not be as affirmative for other technologies as I have been for wind and solar, although it is worthwhile mentioning that geothermal offers a very competitive, low-cost option for firm energy if the resource is proven. And this is where the barrier and the problem lies. The highly unreasonable risk implied by the capital intensive exploration phase to confirm the resources. So unlike solar and wind, geothermal needs some de-risking financial mechanism to attract private investors, private capital. And this is happening. Despite this risk, these mechanisms are being in place, and I can tell you that the African Development Bank has become one of the lead financiers of renewable energy in the African continent, including geothermal. And African Development Bank has been involved in Olkaria and Menengai projects in Kenya, Lake Assal in Djibouti, currently under development, and Korbeti in Ethiopia. Just a few words about storage. The certain interest in storage stems from the technology's renewed value proposition. So battery prices are dropping fast and are likely to reduce further. The battery industry, so prices are dropping fast, actually, and are likely to fall further as massive manufacturing facilities, such as the Tesla's widely ambitious Gigafactory, drive prices down through economies of scale. But this is still aspirational. There is no proven model yet for investment and cost recovery. So this shows, as I did for solar and wind, the downward trend for battery prices since 2010. So there are changing fundamentals in the energy sector. The scale of electricity generation is rapidly shrinking. So from large-scale coal, nuclear power plants that can power millions of homes to solar and wind power plants that can power a few to a few hundred nearby homes. Electricity demand has leveled off so that every unit of new wind or solar power produced for the grid displaces a unit of fossil-fueled energy. And batteries and electric vehicles provide new tools for distributed energy storage, as was presented by a professor last night. And smartphones and smart appliances are giving electricity customers unprecedented opportunities to manage their energy use. So in this context, electricity becomes like a commodity view of electricity becomes obsolete. So kilowatt hours are growing harder to value as daily supply profiles are disrupted by close to zero marginal cost renewable energy. And this shows, I think we discussed that yesterday as well, demand will be shrinking over time, and there is a scenario developed by the International Energy Agency showing that in 2040, there will be a 15% lower demand than in the scenarios of today. And where you see in red is where electricity demand will curb, and in green, it will still increase, but the acceleration will decrease. So this is the era of utility, so of the second generation of utility. So some will call them like smart integrator. So that would be a responsible agent for building, operating, and maintaining a smart grid platform to aggregate the various power sources and make sense, make a good sense of their use, good economic sense of their use. Of course, I said in the beginning that even if they are the most exposed, utilities are not the only players that are concerned by that. Regulators will need to find new ways for utilities to monetize energy savings if they are to move beyond the commodity-based business models in the past. Originally, the grid was built in an ecosystem where producing and providing electricity was complicated and expensive, which was enough of a justification to leave the responsibility to a dedicated entity with the requisite expertise and resources. The utility was that entity that could function with cost recovery plus the return on capital secured, meaning that customers were sentenced actually to pay the cost of inappropriate investment decisions as well by the utilities. That time has changed now. Today, lots of consumers are self-generating powers with renewable energy. So this shift in source and scale is happening. Of course, many utilities are fighting this transition, but the reality is happening. And so a good function or a valuable function would be managing like the various existing capacity. And somebody put it nicely yesterday. It's a way of synergizing all the available options. And that's a potentially valuable function for utilities to think of. So I think that my time has passed, so I'm just gonna show the last slides and close. So this is the solar and wind in the energy mix in 2014. Look at the relative, the proportions in some countries. And look at how it compares to the projections in 2014. These are figures by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So I'm closing by this statement of Antonio Gramsci. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience.
From the Power Institute of East and Southern Africa. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a little bit concerned. Let me say the African Development Bank will be looking at comparative costs of electricity, quoting the United States and ignoring completely nuclear. Is it deliberate? Or is it because the African Development Bank doesn't even want to think about nuclear, so it doesn't even factor it in the comparisons? And the second question is, when you consider the levelized cost of electricity, particularly this issue looking at the new renewables, do you factor in the costs of backup that is necessary in the event that there is no wind, there is no sunshine? Do you factor that, or do you just look at whenever it's available, this is what it costs, but you don't factor in, but you have to have some gas which you can ramp up quickly in case the sun doesn't shine?
First, for the African Development Bank, yes, nuclear energy is out of the scope of the bank. This is the mandate of the bank. I would remind as well that inside the bank, actually, I'm from a team focusing on sustainable energy, so renewable and energy efficiency, and that's the reason why as well, apart from what I just said on nuclear energy, that's the reason why my focus is on those. And on the levelized cost of energy, yes, what is considered is what's available actually to be injected into the grid.
I'd like to get to that point, back to that point of storage, because today's storage costs, Karl Kolmsee from Smart Hydropower, today's storage costs are between 50 to 100 euro or US dollar, it's mainly the same, per megawatt hour. So this drives, if we consider very low cost for renewables, we still, including the cost for storage, we get to a cost level which is well above thermic power. This is not an argument against renewables, and it's not an argument against the changes in the utility sector, but it shows us how much effort and how much R&D we have to put on storage and on new business models that include new storage systems like e-mobility, and this R&D is today not well done. And most of the utilities, I know at least, are not specifically working on the storage issue, but they are fine with just pointing out the low cost of renewable electricity. And this is not good enough. Without a solution for storage, we will not include into our grids a large amount of renewable electricity.
Thank you for this contribution. This is indeed very correct. And I did show a chart with that downward trend on storage prices. So it means that, of course, it is happening very, very slowly, not as fast as we would like. And it's because, and you're very right, it's because not many players have been focusing seriously on R&D for storage. But it's happening now. It's ramping up. And some specialists do think that storage solutions prices have reached an inflection point now, as solar did in 2008. So we are very positive that the years ahead will yield significant results on this situation.
I'm a professor, so I don't like to end a session without a question. So can we have the question for the audience, please? Bank funding needs to become more accessible to utilities. Kindly vote. Oh, so 58% strongly agree that funding is to become more accessible. Thank you all. So now I thank Mr. Sharif for the excellent talk. I call upon Mr. Umashankar to kindly hand over a memento. Sir, please wait. To kindly hand over a memento to Mr. Sharif.